Good afternoon. We come to you from the Walton-Hopeville Cemetery, which is located on Edmond Road in Hopeville, Connecticut. We are right adjacent to Hopeville Pond here. You can see the pond off to my side. Very close to Jewett City, in fact, Connecticut. This is a very remote, isolated cemetery. Very, very difficult to find. Very easy to drive past. As you can see, the growth of the weeds is obscuring most of the headstones in the cemetery. What's really significant about this really old resting ground essentially comes from the name. The Walton family, in fact, is buried here, and you actually cannot find a headstone for the Walton family. They were buried here just within the last 10 years, in fact. This isn't their initial resting place. So, the story behind the Walton family is connected to the vampire legends that have run through Rhode Island and parts of Connecticut. But it's a very recent story, in fact. The story of the Ray family, the Tillinghast, and Mercy Brown. These were known for quite a while. But the Walton story is relatively recent, in fact. Talking really, the archaeological evidence was unearthed in 1990. So, somewhere in Hopeville, and the location is obviously kept under wraps here. Local sand and gravel mining company, was digging up sand and rock from their land, and depositing the debris in large piles. A couple of children had been playing within those debris piles, and 3 boys, in fact, and during their playing, they uncovered 2 human skulls. So 2 partial human remains had been dug up by this gravel company and deposited within these large sand piles. Inadvertently, what had happened was the company had, in fact, unearthed and dug up the partial remains of what was a family burial plot. So immediately startled by the fact that they had unearthed bodies, they brought in the authorities, they brought in the police, but it came down to a Connecticut state archaeologist who works for the University of Connecticut named Nick Bellantoni. He came in to figure out, who had been dug up and where the bodies were located, because it became very, very clear that these weren't just scattered remains of a victim of a crime, for example, but in fact that these were remains of an old cemetery that had been previously unmarked. So Bellantoni did his research, and as his army of students and fellow archaeologists mapped out an area that was about 17 by 25 yards in terms of the area that the cemetery encompassed. Through land records, Bellantoni was able to figure out that a family known as the Waltons had purchased the land before this company had, and they had lived there through many generations up through the 1840s. So this burial plot had been used by the Walton family for the greater part of you're looking at 80 years or so, 80 to 90 years. So the question easily became, because the plots were not labeled, who these people were. There wasn't any kind of record at all as to who was actually buried there. So Bellantoni began the very careful decomposition of the site, decomposing it, breaking it down, finding where each individual was buried. And he discovered in total 27 individuals buried in the graveyard. 5 adult males, 8 adult females, but more significantly 14 children, or child age adolescents. So quite a number of kids were buried into this land. Now, most of the bodies were in pine or wood coffins. They were wrapped in paper, pretty much standard. But nevertheless, just to be thorough, the students and the archaeologists, they collected all the artifacts, hair, wood, pins that were collected from the bodies, and they began to study them. And for the most part, most of these artifacts seem to date back to the 1830s. In fact, real lack of machine-cut nails indicated that this resting place, in general, didn't have anyone who was buried before then, or buried after 1830, I should say. Now, the story gets really interesting when two particular bodies were unearthed. And the two bodies had brass tacks pounded into the top of the coffin, and they were labeled NB13 and JB55. Obviously, first two letters indicating the initials of the decedent, and the second most likely was their age. So this could have been a father or son, or a mother and son, or father-daughter. But it was pretty clear that these two individuals had been related to one another. These two grave sites were distinct from the others because they were actually in small crypts of stone and unmortared brick, whereas the other ones had just been placed into pine boxes. The labeling had been also different as well. The brass tacks that had been pounded into the top of the coffin was very unusual. But the most strange thing about these particular sites, and in the case of JB55, it was most true, or completely true, that the body had been moved. After this individual had died, he had been dug up by somebody, and his bones had been rearranged. JB55's femur bones were pulled up and pulled across his chest, kind of like a skull and crossbones type arrangement. His head was decapitated and turned towards the earth. There was really no explanation as to why this individual had been placed in this configuration, why his body had, been dug up and then essentially vandalized by whoever had dug it up. But it wasn't done recently. The coffin was intact, so this was done by somebody who was a contemporary of this individual. So, as the excavation continued, Bellantoni called in one of his friends, an old classmate named Paul Sledzik, who was curator of the National Museum of Health and Medicine in Washington, D.C., and he actually took a look at the bones. And for the most part, he discovered natural calamities, arthritis, periodontal disease, and so on. And this was true for even JB55, the individual who had his bones rearranged, his or her bones rearranged. But Sledzik did actually find something very significant on JB55. Lesions, pitted whitish-gray lesions on the visceral surface of his ribs. And so essentially what it indicated to him was that there had been some kind of trauma, coughing, vicious coughing, violent coughing, which had caused lesions to form on his ribs. And this was actually a telltale sign of tuberculosis, in particular pulmonary tuberculosis, the presence of these lesions on the ribs. So Bellantoni and Sledzik knew immediately that this individual was different from the other people who had been buried because he had died of tuberculosis. So it's very possible that the NB13 had also died from this very same disease as well. One of Bellantoni's graduate students brought up I shouldn't say the legend, but the story of the Jewett City vampires. In particular, it was the Ray family. The story had been known for a long period of time that tuberculosis had been essentially mistaken for vampirism by these very isolated rural communities. Tuberculosis, of course, being a disease that is a wasting disease, makes people very pallid, their eyes red, they bleed from the mouth, they cough up blood, they lose weight, and they just very slowly waste away. And so, in the cases of Mercy Brown, the Ray family, and the Tillinghast family, it was thought that the first person who contracted the disease after they had died, their spirit was visiting the rest of the family from beyond the grave and draining the life force out of them. Now, Michael Bell, who's a great researcher on these myths and legends in New England, has brought up that the whole idea of a vampire wasn't really known at this time in New England. The idea of a vampire actually came from England, and the work of was an Austrian surgeon. He was a field surgeon. He worked during the war, but his name was Flukinger. And he actually investigated a case outside of Belgrade. And in that area, that was very well known that these kind of superstitions, well, they weren't considered superstitions, but these ideas of people rising from the grave and draining the blood from the living were very popular in these rural communities. And Flukinger actually fed into these rumors. He examined bodies of people who had died of the disease, both past and recent, and he bought in to the fact that individuals who had recently died showed signs of decomposition which was inconsistent with what was known at the time. And so he really accelerated these stories of vampirism in the sense that he supported it. He wrote a paper which turned into a book which spread all throughout England, throughout Europe, and this whole idea of vampires just evolved from this Austrian field surgeon's work just outside of Belgrade in this small village. Now, come back to New England, these stories were relatively unknown in these small rural communities. However, as Michael Bell points out, the idea of a homeopathic type medicine to cure ailments was known. And so, when outbreaks of disease occurred and there seemed to be no source or cure for it, a lot of the times the villagers, the townspeople, would blame supernatural spirits. And it's very, very easy to blame the spirits of people who had first contracted the disease as the source of the supernatural contagion. So in the case of Mercy Brown, essentially the ritual that they were performing was a very common one. Basically, it was a type of folk medicine where you take the innards, you take a fresh heart and lungs, you burn them, you mix them with herbs, and these concoctions were considered remedies to restore life. And of course, we know in those cases it didn't work, but folk medicine endured. The type of farmland medicine, was very, very common. So, how does this relate to the Walton family? Well, there's evidence that this JB55 was dug up well after he died, meaning that perhaps tuberculosis had spread throughout the community. We know that approximately 14 children and adolescents were buried in the cemetery, so it's very possible that the disease spread to them and that they succumbed very quickly to it. So for some reason, some motivating force inspired somebody to dig up JB55's bones. And because he'd been dead a long time, his body had decomposed to the point where his heart and lungs had basically decomposed to an unrecognizable state. So they couldn't perform the ritual on him. They couldn't mix his heart, lungs, or heart and liver. They couldn't burn it and mix it with herbs. Instead, what they had to do was prevent the individual from leaving the grave of his spirit. Again, we're not talking vampirism, we're talking about just a supernatural spirit that would leave the ground and come and visit the victims. You can see in the cemetery here as I'm walking, the graves are literally just being eaten by vegetation. So occasionally I will step on one and I'll try to do my best